Okay, I am going to cover Ezekiel 38 today. My Sunday school class said that they enjoyed my lesson so much Sunday they wanted me to record it so that they could watch it again. So we're going to record this and get it out there for you. We've been covering Revelation, and I wanted to take a pause from Revelation and get with Gog and Magog, with what's lined up in the world events nowadays. It just seemed like it was appropriate to do a study on Gog-Magog war, so we'll be covering this for the next couple of weeks anyway, and I think y'all will really enjoy this lesson. Anyway, we'll just get into it and see where it goes from there. Ezekiel 38, it says, verses 1 through 3. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. First thing from that verse is you need to know is that Gog is a person, and in one of the things they call him a chief prince. Now, if you understand this, a chief prince, we can go to Daniel, and we find out that a chief prince, the one over Israel, is Michael, and he is fighting against the chief prince of Iran, which was Prussia back in that day. And when he left there, he was going to go and fight against the one of Greece. So these chief princes are actually angelic beings that are over these nations. I'm sure the United States probably has their own, chief prince or whatever. But Gog, we're going to see at the end of Revelation, after 1,000-year millennial reign, Gog is going to come back. And so how could that be? How could he be in the Ezekiel war, which we feel like is before the 7-year tribulation? Or Great Tribulation of Revelation, and still be around 1,000 years later. And that's very simple. He's the chief prince, which is not a human being. Now, he does use a human being, a leader of a nation, that to get their things done here on earth. That the chief prince possibly could be something other than, the leader of that nation. But to determine where Gog and some of the nations, Magog, Meshech, and Tubal, are from, we have to learn to go back. The Bible deciphers itself. The best explanation of the Bible is where you can find it in other parts of the Bible. And in this case, we're going to go all the way back to the very beginning, to the table of nations. And in Genesis 10, we're going to find that in verse 32, it says, These were the families of the sons of Noah, according to their generations, in their nations, and from these the nations were divided on earth after the flood. Now, when was the nations divided on earth? They were divided on earth after the flood at the Tower of Babel. Now, if you flip over to Genesis 11, in verse 1, it says, Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And when you skip down to verse 7 through 9, it tells you that God himself says, Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city being the Tower of Babel in that area. And so at this time, these nations were set up on earth according to the languages where he where he confused the language at the Tower of Babel. The Table of Nations. You find that in Genesis 10 and 11, like I said, and it gives you the genealogy of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, Shem, Ham, and Japheth were the three sons of Noah. Remember, whenever the flood happened, Noah put his three sons, his wife, and their wives on the ark, and they were preserved or through the flood, okay? And so these sons went out, and of course they had children, and you will see those in white. Shem had Elam, Asher, Lud, Aram, Aphaxad, and Put. Put is down here at the bottom in white. I'm sorry, not Put, Aphaxad. I'm sorry, Put is under Ham. And so Selah, Eber, Aphaxad, I can't say that, had Salah, and he begat Eber, and Eber begat Joktan and Peleg. And we're going to see this broken down. Peleg is the one that we're most interested in because that's where he begat Ru and Sarug and begat Nahor, and Nahor begat Terah. And the ones that are in red, those are key figures in the Bible. Terah was the father of Abram, which later became Abraham. And then, of course, Nahor and Haran, which is the father of Lot. Now, Ham begat Cush, Mizraim, Canaan, and Put. And Canaan, of course, is the land where when the Israelites came out of Egypt, when Moses led them out of Egypt, they come out and they went across, of course, they wandered around in the desert for 40 years, and then they went across the Jordan River and went into the land of Canaan and overthrew all the ites. You know, you had the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Geshites, the Hivites, Canaanites, and on it goes. And it tells you that in Genesis 10 if you want to go and take a look at that. Cush, under Ham, begat some children, Seba, Havilah, Sabatah. Anyway, you get to Ramah, and Ramah begat Sheba and Dedan. And Sheba and Dedan will be talked about in this Ezekiel study that we're going to do. Also, he begat Nimrod. Cush begat Nimrod, and Nimrod, if you know, was the first world leader. He was the first world dictator, if you will. He gathered up all the nations during that time, and they are the ones that built the Tower of Babel that God had to come down and intercede and destroy and make the nations. Now, Japheth, the last son of Noah, he has Gomer, who begat Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. Japheth also had Javan. We're going to see his kin or his sons in Tarshish. We'll talk about that later when we get into Ezekiel, where Tarshish may be. But Japheth gave Gomer, Javan, Magog, Madai, Tubal, Meshech, and Tyrus. Those were his sons. And a lot of these names you're going to recognize if you've read Ezekiel 38 and 39. You're going to recognize these names. Gomer, Togarmah, Magog, Tubal, Meshech, and Tyrus. And I'm going to talk a little bit about them probably more next week. May get into a little bit today, but we're going to talk about where all these are found in the Ezekiel, especially this Magog, because that's what we call this, the Magog War, the Magog Invasion. So there was a poet, we call him a Greek poet, but he actually wrote in the 8th century. Now, Ezekiel was in the 7th century BC. And so in 8th century BC, we find out a little bit more about Magog. Modern scholars place him in the same period of Greek literature as Homer. These are ancient historians. Hesiod is also credited with composing works and days, the earliest example of didactic poetry, and that means that it's instructive rather than to be entertaining. So his poetry was really a history or to instruct us as he was writing his poetry. He speaks of the Magogians by their Greek name. So even a century before Ezekiel wrote the prophecy about the Magog invasion, he tells us the Magogians were called the Scythians. Okay, now that may ring more bells with you. Herodotus was another historian. He's a Greek history known as the father of history, and he basically is. He traveled extensively throughout the Mediterranean world, observing the different peoples he encountered, and he was basically studying the military history of the region because he was a Greek poet, and Greek was going to take over one day, and so they wanted to know how all the other nations' military, how they did their military campaigns, and he studied that for the Greek. And he wrote that, and Herodotus produced a narrative compilations of his findings entitled History. And we use that a lot to learn about the ancient histories of mankind. Numerous archaeologists' discoveries have clearly confirmed that Herodotus' reports in general were right on, and his Scythian accounts in particular. So when we talk about the Scythians, which is the Greek name for Magog, Magog would be the Hebrew name, the Scythians would be Greek name of them. And so Josephus, which also wrote Antiquities, and he lived during the time of basically through the time of Jesus. He also oversaw or got to see the overthrow of Jerusalem in 70 AD by the Roman Empire. And he actually wrote in his Antiquities, it says, Magog founded the Magogians, okay, thus named after him, but were by the Greeks called Scythians. And so this is how we know that the Scythians is Magog. So when you look at the Scythians, I just want to talk to you a little bit about that, the identity. So you have Hesiod, Herodotus, Phileo, Josephus. All those are historians that all talks about Gog, Magog as being Scythians. Soviet archaeologists' discoveries confirm this, and even if we did not have these historians, we could always look back at the Bible and it tells us they're going to come from the uttermost parts of the north. Well, when you put your finger on the map of Israel and you go to the uttermost parts of the north, you're going to run into Russia all the way to the North Pole, nothing else. You have Turkey and then you have Russia, and it goes all the way to the North Pole. So even if we didn't have these archaeologists or these historians to tell us that the Scythians was Russia, the Bible itself, the uttermost parts of the earth. All right. So the various descendants of Magog terrorized the southern steppes of Russia for centuries, and from Ukraine to the Great Wall of China. Now, most people don't know because they don't really pay attention to maps and things, but get you a globe or get you a world map laid out flat, and you're going to see that Russia encompasses a large amount of property. I mean, they have a huge amount of territory. It covers 11 time zones. Now, just stop and think about that for a minute. America, the United States of America, the continental United States only covers 4. You add Alaska and Hawaii, and that gives you 6. And then you add the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, which is way out east. That's only 7 time zones. But Russia's main landmass covers 11 time zones. So that's how during all the wars, like you can start back with, think about Napoleon and Hitler. They went into the motherland of Russia, and how they were defeated was not by the Russian army. They were defeated by the weather, the winter. They got so far into Russia that there was no escape out before winter hit, and most of them starved. Napoleon, I can't remember how many men he went in with, but it was hundreds of thousands. And when he left, there was only 10,000 living. And so most of those succumbed to starvation and the weather. But from the 10th century before Christ, 10th BC, to the 3rd century BC, the Scythians basically ruled that area that we know as southern Russia. And the China Wall, the Great Wall of China that you see here, was built to keep the Scythians from invading China. That's what it's the wall that was to keep them out. And apparently it worked, because you don't hear much about the Scythians in China, although we do get a lot of our historical records about the Scythians from the Chinese, because they kept very good records about them. Now, another group I want to talk about, so basically we know that the Scythians now is Russia. That's where we're talking about, that area. And the next group I want to talk about is the Cimmerians. The Cimmerians were the oldest of the European tribes living north of the Black Sea and the Danube, and whom we know by the name they used for themselves. So they called themselves the Cimmerian. The Cimmerian period in the history of southern Ukraine began in the late 11th century BC. The Cimmerians were the first specialized horse nomads to make their name in history. And here's an easy way to remember the Cimmerians. Cimmerians were excellent bow and arrow users. They just made it they were specialists at it. And so anytime you go to a museum or anything and you look on pottery and that type of thing, you're going to see usually a rider, and he's turned backwards and shooting his bow and arrow. And that's always a depiction of the Cimmerian, because they were just, like you have your excellent swords people, they were excellent at the bow and arrow. They said that they could actually ride a horse at full gallop, shoot a bird in flight off their horse, and never miss. So as soon as the children started walking, they handed them a bow, and they just made it an art form from what they could do with the bow and arrow. They are first mentioned in secular literature in the Odyssey and the Iliad of Homer in the 8th century BC, in Assyrian cuneiform text from the 8th century BC before Ezekiel. I mean, this was before Ezekiel. And of course in Herodotus, which was wrote in the 5th century BC. Herodotus indicates that the whole North Pontic steppe region, okay, occupied in his time by the Scythians, belonged earlier to the Cimmerians. So the Scythians obviously overthrew the Cimmerians and scooted them a little further south and east and west. So some scholars derive the name of Crimea. Now you hear that a lot in the news today. The Crimea, which is that island right that the Russians own in the Black Sea. Some scholars derive the name of Crimea from the Cimmerians. That's how it got its name. So that's the area, just so you understand the areas that we're talking about. So Russia, Ukraine, the Black Sea, those areas definitely are involved in this Gog Magog situation. And in the 5th century BC, the Cimmerians were driven south over the Caucasus by the Scythians in a domino-like effect as the Scythians themselves were pushed westward by the other tribes. And this can be correlated with the Chinese. Like I said, the China had lots of records on this, and so you can correlate that about the Scythians. Numerous references in the Talmud have left little doubt that these descendants of Gomer, okay, because you got to remember these are his children, Gomer then moved northward, and they established themselves in the Rhine and Danube valleys. And if you take a look at that, you're going to realize that Gomer is Germany, okay? And so there's two of your Gomer and Magog that is talked about in this Ezekiel war. So the Scythians, let's get back to that. After being repulsed from Media, many of the later Scyths settled in the fertile area of the Ukraine north of the Black Sea. And the reason why we're talking about this today is because Ukraine is all over the news for the last few weeks. And I just want to show y'all how this may be playing into the bear of Russia actually rising up a little bit, lifting up his head, taking a look around before he invades what we call the Magog Invasion of Israel. And so we just need to keep our eye on this and just pay attention and just be aware of what may be starting to happen in world events. Other related tribes occupied the area to the east of the Caspian Sea, but Herodotus describes them living in Scythia. Scythia as a square, which is 20 days' journey. It was 360 miles on a side. It encompassed the lower reaches of the Dniester, the Bug, the Dnieper, and Don rivers, where they flow back into the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. All right. So we noticed, we talked about Gomer, which is Germany. We've talked about Magog, which we feel like is Russia, from several different ancient historians giving us that information. So let's take a look at the other allies of Magog that we're going to find in Ezekiel. You got Japheth, who obviously had Gog and Magog. The Cimmerians settled along the Danube and the Rhine. I've told y'all that. Ashkenaz was a son of Gomer. All the way back in Genesis 10, Gomer had Ashkenaz, and that is where they settled, is in the land of Germany. Rephoth, Josephus tells us, was in Europe from Rephoth. Togarmah. Now, Togarmah is talked about quite a bit. In fact, two of the cities in Armenian, which is present-day Turkey and Turkestan. And so their cities actually named after in fact, they're known as the family of Togarmah. So that's pretty easy to figure out where they are. So they're in modern-day Turkey. Magog, of course, is the Scythians, and we know that from those historians that we just covered recently, that is the land of Russia. Now, Japheth also had more sons. We have Madai, which is the Medes or the Kurds, and the Kurds right now is living in western Turkey, kind of in, I say Turkey, they're kind of like I don't want to say a nomad. They've been pushed out by Saddam Hussein, who, remember, gassed the Kurds and the Turks, and so they have set up their own camp, and there is millions living there. And in the New Testament, there is still saying the Kurds are going to come back and do something. So keep your eye on that, because that's really Something important to notice also. But they emerged about the 10th century BC, coalition with Persia, which we know as Elam. Okay, Elam, also back in Genesis 10, we are told is a son of Shem. Tubal is eastern Anatolia, and Meshech. Both of those you can find in eastern Anatolia, which is ancient Anatolia, but anyway, that is modern day Turkey now. So Tubal and Meshech is Turkey. Tyrus is of the I can't even say this, Pelasgians of the Argean, the Etruscans of Italy. So those are the areas that they cover. And then Jovan or Javan we know is Ionia, which is Greece. And there's actually, they still call a city there of Jovan. Now Jovan's important to us because out of that we have his sons were Elisha, Tarshish, which a lot of people believe may be the British Isles or the coastline up of Europe, which would be Western Europe. And then you have Kittim and Dodandum. And so we will talk more about this Tarshish when we get to it in Ezekiel, but just be aware that that could possibly be the British Isles. Elam, this is a son of Shem, I just told you, was Persia, which is Iran, modern day Iran. And then he had other sons, Shem did, Asher and Aphaxad. And this is really important because when you get down here, like I said, out of Peleg became Abraham, which is the father of the Jewish nation. So here you have a picture of Magog and all of his allies. Magog being Russia, Gomer all the way up in Germany, Meshech and Tubal and Togarmah is Turkey. Persia would be Iran. Of course, you have Israel sitting right in the middle of all this. Then you have two sons from Ham's line, and that would be Put, and a lot of times that'll be spelled P-U-T in the Bible, but Put, Libya, and Cush. And Cush encompasses southern Egypt all the way down into the Sudan and Ethiopia. Put consists of Libya and the northern coast of Africa. So you've got things up there like Libya, and I can't think of them, Morocco, and but anyway, that northern African coastline. And all these will conglomerate to come against Israel in the Magog War. So I want to talk to you a little bit today as how this stacks up with what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. But before we do that, I want to just touch on another verse in Deuteronomy. We were talking about the chief priest of Gog. Now, one of the things you need to understand is that Gog is a person, okay? A leader of the nation, or as this says, chief priest over that nation. But Magog is the land that he's the chief priest or the leader of. So Magog we know as Russia, but Gog is its leader. Now, is that Putin? I highly doubt it, but it could be. It just depends on when the timing is correct. You know, something could happen to Putin, and the next person that comes into office could be the Gog that we are talking about. But I want to show you Deuteronomy 32 because there's a couple of verses here that are really interesting that I want to talk more about probably next session. But it says, when the Most High, and the Most High being, of course, God, divided their inheritance, let me move myself here, divided their inheritance to the nations when he separated the sons of Adam. Now, the sons of Adam are humans, okay? God created Adam, and everything that came from Adam was from man's seed, okay? We were not directly created by God. We were man's seed. And so when he separated the sons of Adam back at the Tower of Babel, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of children of Israel. For the Lord's portion is his people. So who is God's people? The Lord's portion is what we would consider Israel, or the Jewish nation. And Jacob, of course, we remember Jacob's name was changed by God to Israel after he fought with the angel of the Lord. His name became Israel. So Jacob is the place of his inheritance. Whose inheritance? God's inheritance. That's why the Jewish people is always known as God's people. He found him, and this is God saying, God found him, Abram, before he changed his name to Abraham, he found him in a desert land And in the wasteland, a howling wilderness, he encircled him. He kept him as the apple of his eye. And as an angel stirs up its nest and hovers over its young, spreading out its wings and taking them up, carrying them on its wings, so the Lord alone led him. Led who? Abram, which will later become Abraham. And there was no foreign God with him. So what God is saying is, he called Abram out of the land of Ur. And because Abram obeyed him and followed him and had no other foreign gods, he trusted in God alone. Then God covered over him and took care of him and promised him that he would be a man of not just one nation, but many nations. Remember, Abraham had two sons. He had Ishmael first, then he had Isaac. And Isaac, of course, is the lineage of the Israel people, and Ishmael is what you would think of today as your Arabic people, or Arabs. And so, or Aramaic, I'll get the right word out in a minute. Aramaic people, you can think, well, you can think of Saudi Arabia down in that area, the Arabic line of people. Not Muslims, Arabs. Totally different. When the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations, excuse me, when he separated the sons of Adam, again back at the Tower of Babel. Now, I'm sorry, let me explain. I'm going to read this verse 8 because this is really important. I want to read it again, but I want to read it from the Septuagint version. And the Septuagint version of the Bible, you need to understand, was written in the 3rd century before Christ, BC. It is the first known translation of the Hebrew Bible, and it was translated into the Greek. Okay? And so our Bible that we get today is from the Messianic text, and that was not done until the 8th or 9th century AD. So there's almost 1,000 years difference between when the Septuagint version was translated and when the Messianic text was translated. So a lot of times we'll go back to the Septuagint version because it is so ancient, and the writings there really clarify a lot of the things in our Messianic text that may have some differences in the way that it's written, and it gives us some clarification. So I want to read this verse out of that Septuagint text so that you understand, because it changes the meaning of this quite a bit. So in verse 8 it says, when the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations, when he separated the sons of Adam, again humankind, at the Tower of Babel, he, being God, set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the angels of God. That's a lot of difference from what we read in our Messianic derived Bible. Angels of God in Hebrew is B'nai Ha Elohim. And what it means is it's a direct creation of God. That's what it means. It's only used in 3 circumstances in the Bible. It's used many times in the Old Testament and just a few times in the New Testament, but it's only in 3 certain instances or circumstances. One being Adam. Adam was a B'nai Ha Elohim. He was a direct creation of God. God took some red clay mud and he spit on it, and he formed a man, and he blew in it, and Adam was created. He came to life. Now the next B'nai Ha Elohim is used all throughout the Old Testament, and it's directly talking about angels. And so that's why this angels of God in verse 8, that term is B'nai Ha Elohim. Now, the third instance that we see this word used is on born-again Christians. We are all sons of Adam until we are born again. And that's what we call when we say we've given our life over to Christ. We are born again. God does not repair our heart. He doesn't fix the old broken heart. No, he gives us a new heart, the New Testament tells us. And so you are then a direct creation of God. We know that the Holy Spirit lives within us. And so only 3 instances, Adam, angels, and born-again Christians. Well, since born-again Christians wasn't around back when the Tower of Babel was created, and Adam, of course, had already died at this point, then the only thing left, angels of God. And that's how the Septuagint actually translates that term in their Bible. And then I want to take you to one more translation, because I thought this really brought it home to us. And this is the New Living Translation, a Bible that we have readily today that you can get. And it translates that exact same verse 8 as, when the Most High, God, assigned lands to the nations, when he divided up the human race again at the Tower of Babel, he established the boundaries of the peoples according to the number in his heavenly court. How many of you knew that God had a heavenly court? Well, we see shadows and copies of that here on earth. The Sanhedrin, which is the court of the Jewish elders, has 70 members. And so the court in heaven is assumed to have 70 chief priests or chief princes over it. And when you get to Daniel, I think it's chapter 9 talks about that. No, I think it's 10 or 11. I'm pretty sure it's 10. Daniel chapter 10 tells us the chief prince, Michael, is over Israel. And he was fighting with the prince of Persia. And then when he left talking with Daniel, he came in and explained a few things to Daniel. And he said, no, I have to go back and fight with the prince of Greece. So these chief priests, or these chief princes, are over these nations, and they influence their leaders. The 12 sons of Jacob is another example of 70. When you remember when the famine came and Jacob sent his sons into the land of Egypt to get grain, and Joseph, they had sold Joseph, and Joseph was the prime minister of Egypt. He sent them back and said, go get my dad. And so he came. Jacob came with his 12 sons, or 11 sons. Joseph was already there. And they brought with them 70 people. And I always say they went in as a family, but they came out with Moses as a nation. 1 to 2 million people came out of the land of Egypt. A lot of people don't realize how extensive these numbers are. But anyway, they came out a nation. Hebrews gives us a little bit of insight into this as well. It says, for if he were on earth, now this is talking about Jesus. Paul is telling us, for if Jesus were on earth, he would not be a priest, since there are priests who offer the gifts according to the law, who serve the copy and the shadow of the heavenly things. So what is Paul telling us here? That the temple where they sacrificed, and even the tabernacle where they sacrificed the offerings and all that, and they did this according to it's just a copy and a shadow of heavenly things done here on earth. So what is the copy and shadow of things that's happening actually in heaven? And so when you do look at that, it says Moses was divinely instructed when he was about to make the tabernacle. For he said, he being God again, capital letter H, he said, see that you make all things according to the pattern shown to you on the mountain. Well, where did he get this pattern? What mountain are we talking about? This is Mount Sinai. When Moses went up on Mount Sinai, and remember he was given the 2 tablets with the 10 commandments written with the finger of God, right? And so I always hand it to Chuck Missler, which is a great Bible teacher. He always says, that Moses should have come off the mountain with the 2 stone tablets and a roll up under his arm of the pattern or the blueprints of the tabernacle, which of course was the tent of the before the temple was actually erected several hundred years later. So that gives you an idea about the chief priests and the divinely copy and shadow of what we do here on earth is just things that's going out and playing out in heaven. And another scripture that you can take to, and I didn't take time to make a slide for this, but you can look at is Ephesians, I think it's 5, and it talks about we don't fight against flesh and blood, but against princes and principalities and dark evil ones. Those are the things that we are actually fighting against, and we do that through putting on the whole armor of God and fighting them in our prayer life. And so there are things playing out that we cannot see, but we are just mimicking down here on earth. All right, so back to the modern day nations involved in Magog. So Gomer, we know, is Germany, and Gomer's sons was Ashkenaz, which we call Deutschland. That is just what everybody else besides Americans call Germany. Germany is actually called by the people who live there as Deutschland. Togarmah, we know, is Turkey. I left that out. Sorry. Togarmah is Turkey. They actually are known by the House of Togarmah. Magog is Russia. Madai is the Persian and southern Russia, which we would consider as modern day Iran now. Jovan is Greece. There's actually a city in Greece called Jovan. Tubal and Meshech were ancient Anatolia, which is Turkey. Tyrus is Thrace, or modern day Romania, Moldova, Bulgaria, eastern Greece, and northern eastern Turkey. So again, it's part of that Turkey area in Greece, and parts of Italy even. And these nations are going to be joined by sons of Ham, which is Cush and Put. And Cush entails Ethiopia, southern Egypt, and the Sudan. And Put, of course, is the northern Africa west of Egypt. So start at Egypt and go west along the Africa coastline, and that's what you're talking about, Libya and those countries. So that'll give you a good idea of what countries we're looking at that's going to be invading Israel at some point. And it says here, I will turn, Ezekiel 38 says, I will turn you around and put hooks into your jaws and lead you out with all your army, horses and horsemen, all splendidly clothed, a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya are with you, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all its troops, the house of Togarmah, but from the far north and all its troops, many people are with you. And so a lot of people wants to know what many people does that mean that are with them. Excuse me. And that could include all those terrorist organizations that's not mentioned in here. This is kind of like a big outer circle around around Israel, but the inner circles we didn't talk about. Lebanon, the Gaza Strip, Syria, oh my gosh, let me come on around. Iraq. Those are the inner circles around there. And so what's going on with them? Well, those could be the many peoples that are with you, or it could be something like the NATO nations. Could include the United States, parts of Western Europe that is part of the NATO system. I don't know. We don't know. We'll just have to watch and see how this plays out. But it is essential for us to understand this verse 4. That's why I have it highlighted in white. It says, I will turn. Now, this is God, just so you understand. This is God talking to Gog, G-O-G, Gog, of the land of Magog. And what he tells him, God tells him, I will turn you around. I will put hooks into your jaws and lead you out with all your army. And so that's a pretty heavy statement. And so I want to talk about that just a little bit, because that's what I think we are starting to see, is hooks being put into the jaws of the Russian leaders and bringing them into a situation where all these countries will consolidate in some way. I don't know if it'll be a treaty. I don't know if they'll be pulling them back to the Warsaw Pact. I don't know exactly how that's going to happen. But Ukraine is definitely part of the Gog or Magog invasion. As we saw them called the Cimmerians, definitely part of it. And you have to remember, Ukraine at one point was part of the USSR. It was part of the Soviet Union. And so when the end of World War II happened, of course, that broke apart, and then these countries started breaking apart from the Soviet Union. But as we see them go back, maybe interesting to see what we're going to look at. So let's take a look at this. We turned around and pulled out. Now I wanted to tell you just a little bit. When you go back and you look at this in the Hebrew, this I will turn you around. It's a phrase that's used by putting something in your head. You're putting a notion, or you're putting an idea in someone's head. And then it says it's going to put hooks into your jaws, meaning that you're going to be led like a horse. I mean, they're going to bridle you. They're going to put, it actually means thorns stuck in the jaws so that they can lead you. That's the terminology that the Hebrews use. And it says, and lead you out with all your armies. And so Russia really isn't going to have a choice in this. And here's where I want to go with this, because looking at Ukraine, there's a couple of things that has happened. We've been hearing about Russia, Russia, Russia. So why did Russia invade Ukraine? This is a prime example of how hooks can be put in the jaw and a country can be made, or their leaders can be made to actually invade another country. And so I'm going to give y'all a little heads up. Now, before I start, I want you to understand, I am not pro-Putin. I am not pro-Russia. I'm just giving you actual information that you can do with as you please. But I want you to understand how we can't just look at all the news and propaganda that we're being bombarded with on what's going on in Ukraine. There's more behind it than what most people realizes. And so what I'm going to talk about is not that I'm pro anything, because I'm not. Russia is going to invade Israel. I'm pro-Israel. I'm pro-America, United States of America. But I'm definitely not pro-Russia. But I can see why Russia went into Ukraine just from the things that I'm going to show you here in a few minutes. One of the things I want you to understand is all of a sudden it's stage left, exit the virus. And all of a sudden we've got stage right, entering into a war. Have you noticed in the news, we've not heard anything about the pandemic here lately. It's all about the war. So our narrative has changed, and the propaganda is escalated on what's going on in the Ukraine. With that being said, let's take a look at a map. This is the map of NATO. NATO stands for North American Treaty Organization. And you can see it encompasses basically the United States, Canada, all of North America. And then it encompasses part of Europe. We have up at the top where it says Norwegian Sea, that is that's Norway. And then of course you see Iceland, and you come down and you see the United Kingdom. You've got Spain and France and Germany, and all of them are involved in it. And all the way over until, I don't know if you can see my mouse here or not, but Turkey, which is your far right horizontal country laying down there. That is actually Turkey. A lot of people don't realize Turkey's actually a member of NATO and has been from the very beginning. But we're going to show you some maps of that again in a minute. So I want you to understand we have to go back in time to find out what's going on. NATO, Russia, and the Warsaw Pact. Okay, so NATO countries was in 1990. These were the NATO countries other than North America. This is just Europe we're looking at. But NATO encompassed those, in 1990, those countries. And the Warsaw Pact countries was the Soviet Union and Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. That's what we were looking at under the Warsaw Pact. Now, in 2015, you can see how NATO has moved westward, and has taken over. Russia has shrunk in size. Soviet Union is not nearly as big as what it used to be. It has shrunk quite a bit, and new countries has erected out of that, which is Ukraine and Bulgaria. And so up into the Ukraine, Bulgaria, and I can't remember some of these other smaller countries right around Belarus and Ukraine. And then you have some smaller countries down here around Romania and Bulgaria. But Belarus and Ukraine are the two that we really want to look at today. Now, here's a little history lesson. Back in the 90s, when Senior Bush, our President Bush Sr., was our president, he promised that NATO would never move westward. Then right after he said that, look how it grew from 1990 to 1950. What did they do? They started surrounding Russia. So Russia backed up, and they gave country space up to Ukraine and Belarus. And in the next map is going to show that. Now, why is this all important? I'm going to show you something. We're going to leave this NATO information just for a few minutes, and I'm going to take you to the next slide to show you something that happened back in January that our news media has barely blipped on, but it was really important when you look at geopolitics. And it involved a country that most of us have never heard of and have no idea where it is on the map, but it involved Kazakhstan. And what happened was they had a color revolution try to start up in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan intelligence chief, who was Hunter Biden's close friend and posed with him and Joe, is charged with treason during protests that have seen 160 killed and 8,000 arrested. The last time I looked, that was up to 12,000 folks have been arrested in Kazakhstan. So how does that play out? Well, this guy, Karim Masimov, ran Kazakhstan's National Security Committee until he was fired by the country's embattled president late last week. Now, let me give you some background on this. So we have a country that was upset about the price of gas. And so they started a peaceful protest. And then all these strange people started coming in during this peaceful protest. And they brought guns and firearms. And the former intelligence chief of security of the nation actually had their officials abandon buildings so that these weird people that had come in could get arms. In other words, they could get guns and different firearms out of these buildings. And so this Karim Masimov basically just turned over, firearms, military firearms, to these protesters who were not really protesters. The peaceful protesters went home, or they maybe got involved with it's just what we saw in 2020, where we had peaceful protests going on in large cities, and all of a sudden you have these people in black start coming in, and y'all know which, can't say it on the YouTube or we'll be kicked off, but you know what organizations were behind that. And they started a fight, basically, and we saw cities burn down because of it. Well, that's what went on in Kazakhstan. And so this Karim Masimov, he and other unnamed intelligent officials were arrested the day after they were fired. Hunter Biden once called Massimo a good friend in an email from 2016. An updated photo appears that shows Joe and Hunter Biden smiling along Kazakh businessman Kenes Rekeshev, also as well as this Massimo. This Massimo guy is pretty important. It was originally published by the anti-corruption group called the Kazakhstani Initiative on Asset Recovery and has not been independently verified. But reports claim that Hunter traveled all the way from Paris to Kazakhstan without his Secret Service detail in 2014 to discuss, guess what, a Burisma deal with Massimo. And the photo, of course, resurfaced in 2020 during the elections of between Trump and Biden. And, of course, we were told it was misinformation and everything else. And of course, all this come off the laptop from what they call, the news media calls a laptop from hell, that has all this information on it. So Kazakhstan's former intelligence chief, Karim Masimov, who Hunter Biden had described as a close friend, was arrested last week and charged with high treason as violent anti-government demonstrations there see more than 160 people killed and nearly 8,000, like I said, now it's up to 12,000 more injured or arrested. Marisimov was arrested on Thursday by his own agency. They announced this over the weekend. Toward the end of the week of bloody protests sparked by a virtually overnight spike in fuel prices. Let me move myself out of the way. It says on Wednesday he was fired from his role heading Kazakhstan National Security Committee by President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. Now, he previously served as the country's prime minister. Now, here's what I want you to understand. This Massimo person who has been arrested, who was on the National Security Council for Kazakhstan, was the previous prime minister from 2007 to 2012, and again from 2014 to 2016. And I want you to bring that into focus because I want you to understand who was our president and vice president during those years. Obama and Vice President Biden, okay? And so now we have this guy who was the prime minister, who was meeting with Hunter Biden, and then in He's now sitting on the National Security Council for Kazakhstan, and he's been arrested and is going to be tried for high treason of this country's overthrow. Because what happened was this demonstration turned into just what we saw in our big cities in 2020, and they tried to overthrow the sitting president or prime minister of Kazakhstan. And of course, the prime minister was smart enough. He called Putin. He actually called our Blankton, was it Anthony Blankton? Is that his name? Tony Blankton, maybe. Called him up and said, "Hey, you know, what do you want us to do what can you do to help us?" And you know what? Blankton said, "Well, you just need to sit down with them and negotiate." So the dude hung up the phone and called up Putin, and Putin within a week had this insurrection, and that's exactly what it was. It was an insurrection of the government officials, and they had it put down. Unfortunately, 160 and over 12,000 arrested during that demonstration, that peaceful protest. But they put it down pretty quickly. Now, it says a photo unearthed in October 2020 appears to show Joe Biden meeting with Marismov and this businessman, Kazakhstan businessman, his son Hunter's alleged business partner in Kazakhstan. Hunter and Masimov reportedly became friendly when the then vice president's son served on the board of, get this, the Ukrainian energy company Burisma, and Masimov was his second stint as Kazakh prime minister. So this has got corruption written all over it. I don't care how you look at it. I pulled these directly off the internet. These were news releases that was released with Kazakhstan that our news media over here barely touched. And it goes on to say that the pair met up in Kazakhstan sometime in 2014 when Biden's son left, Hunter Biden left his security detail, and they discussed potential energy deal with Burisma. Now, Burisma was all over the news as well, but we'll get to that in just a moment. So I want you to understand, here is a map, and this is really important because I want you, in fact, I think the next map's even more. I want you to notice where Kazakhstan is on this map. Take a look here. This is Kazakhstan. This is all Russia, the yellow. Kazakhstan is this green over here on the right. On your left, you see the orange is Ukraine. And in between the two is Russia. Russia. If this security or this color revolution would have happened in Kazakhstan and they had actually overthrown the government there, and then we know the ties, and Ukraine had went with the NATO allies, because that's what this is all about, is NATO. Ukraine wanted to become a NATO member. They had promised him the world to become a NATO member, and that poor president, who, by the way, is Jewish. I don't know if anybody knows that or not, or many people knows that, but Zelensky is actually a Jewish, he's a Jew. And so he believed NATO. NATO said, hey, we're going to back you. You want to become a member of NATO, we're going to do everything we can to keep Russia off your back. And unfortunately, Russia said, we're not going to have that. And the reason why Russia does not want to have that is because if Ukraine joins NATO, that then gives NATO direct border control right up next to Russia. That gives that gives NATO first missile strike capability. And it's just like remember when we had the Cuba Missile Crisis back in the 60s? What happened? Russia was going to come over here and put nuclear warheads on Cuba, and America said, not going to happen, because that would have gave Russia first strike capability. And so, remember, we sent our warships that almost caused a war. We lined them up, their ships came in, and at the last minute, their ships turned around and went back home. And it was avoided, but it was very close, and a lot of people was really worried about that. It was a crisis during JFK's term. And so, they sent them back home. Now, we're doing with NATO, our allies at NATO, because we are the North American Alliance Treaty Organization, is doing the exact same thing to Russia. So Russia didn't have a choice but to go into Ukraine, because Putin has told us over and over and over, you're never going to have first strike capability against Russia. And so when Ukraine started talking to go to NATO, all they have to say is we're going to put missiles on your border with Russia. And if you're a member of NATO, that's what you have to do. So Putin had really thorns put in his jaw, okay? A hook was put into him and pulled into Ukraine. He done what any good national leader would have done. If it would be the same as if Russia was trying to put nuclear warheads or first strike capability along the Canadian-America border or even along Mexico or even in Cuba again. We would be up in arms and we would go to war over that. That is exactly what Putin was faced with. He didn't have a choice. It was either take Ukraine back and keep NATO off of them or allow NATO to come in and have first missile strike on the Russian territories. And so that stopped. Now, again, look at this map. You got Kazakhstan on one side. This is going on the other, that NATO. This happened within Kazakhstan uprising happened in January, and Ukraine took place at the end of February. I do not think this was a coincidence. I do not think this was a coincidence. I think this is America and other powers that be in Europe poking the finger in the bear of Russia and making him rise. He's got no choice but to protect his country. Now, I want everybody to understand, my heart bleeds for the Ukrainian people. The middle-class people that weren't wealthy enough to get out of the country, along with all the other rich people. I mean, they're just showing you the old people and stuff. But let me tell you something. All their oligarchs, all their businessmen, their professional class, all got on a plane and got a 3-year, listen to this, 3-year residency, no passport needed, into the European Union. So, you know, who's going to run Ukraine now if all the business and professional class are gone? They've left them with the middle class who are there trying to fight off this huge army coming in on their country. And NATO and America is just standing back and watching. And, you know, Ukrainian President Zelensky is just up in arms about it. Why are you not over here helping us? You know, like I said, they promised this president the world, and they've delivered basically nothing. And so we're just watching Russia just walk through Ukraine and taking it over city by city by city. But there's more to this story, because here's something else that I dug out. I saw a little piece on this, and I thought, well, I'm going to do a little more research. And I found these headlines. And it said, Putin orders military to destroy biolabs in Ukraine as U.S. scrubs evidence of their existence. And we know that the news is all the time yelling and screaming, we don't have biolabs, we don't have biolabs. Well, guess who's involved in this? Headline USA, Echo Health Alliance alleged CIA front organization tied to the Wuhan lab leak. You remember, the coronavirus came out of the Wuhan lab. And it says, why would the U.S. government pay and train Chinese scientists to conduct infectious disease research in China? And if I move myself, the story goes on to say that John Ransom of Headline USA, as more myths about the coronavirus pandemic begin to unravel, Echo Health Alliance, the group of federally funded researchers who were collaborating with scientists studying the virus at the Wuhan Lab Institute of Virology, have come under sharp scrutiny. Questions already have arisen in the congressional inquiries as to whether the group, which received a sizable grant from the National Institute of Health, was aware that China was engaged in controversial gain-of-function research, and whether they misled grant overseas, including top U.S. virologist Anthony Fauci. Boy, ain't he a popular guy right now. So basically, what documents that has been released from our own Department of Defense has said is that Anthony Fauci was told not to give this grant to the Wuhan labs, and he went around them and done it anyway. Well, guess what? It's not the only lab they've granted money to. And, you know, like I said, our news and propaganda shoves down our throats that we're not involved in them, but we've got one in Maryland right now. But anyway, so I went doing a little digging just to see what I could find, and it wasn't hard. The U.S. Embassy in Ukraine, here's one of their documents released. All right, so anyway, the usembassy.gov released this. Now, I wish there was a date on this, but there's not. But it says Biological Threat Reduction Program. The U.S. Department of Defense's Biological Threat Reduction Program collaborates with partner countries to counter the threat of outbreaks, deliberate, accidental, or natural, of the world's most dangerous infectious disease. These programs accomplishes its bio-threat reduction mission through the 2016. Oh, well, and I think there went on. And then I cut the part that I thought was most important. Basically, what this went on to say is that there are labs out there, and the U.S. was trying to reduce, they're just biochemical warfare is what it is. And they are giving them gain of function to be released, or their biological weapons that will be released. But it says Biosurveillance Network of the Silk Road. Here's the part that I thought was really interesting. It goes on to say in 2016, the Ministry of Health in Ukraine and the State Service of Ukraine on Food Safety and Consumer Protection signed a memorandum on joining a multinational working group with the goal to strengthen global health security and create well-functioning disease surveillance networks in the Eastern European region. That includes, I want you to really pay attention to these countries, okay? Azerbaijan, I can't even say that one, but Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. That is the countries these bio labs are set up in that we are financing. Taxpayer money is financing. Now, let's go back to the world map, and I want to show you where those countries are. Well, we know where Ukraine is. We learned where Kazakhstan is. Georgia is on the south border of Russia. It sits between, it's the green country between Turkey and Russia. And that one I could not pronounce is that little brown, purpley looking, plum colored look right beside Georgia. Do you see these biolabs circling Russia? Again, I do not think that Putin and his government, by the way, Putin's not doing this by all on his own. You have to remember, his upper chamber of his government, kind of like our Senate, voted to invade Ukraine to stop NATO from coming in on their border. So, not that I'm agreeing with Russia, I'm just laying out facts so that you understand how hooks can be put in to these leaders' jaws and lead them off into war. And that's the whole point of this study, or today's topic. Now, while the whole world is focused on the Ukraine, I want to show you some headlines that's going on in the rest of the world. Because all we're hearing about right now is Russia and Ukraine, right? One of the top headlines, I think this came out maybe Thursday, said agreement to restore Iran nuclear deal expected within days. European diplomat states. And of course, retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg discusses the implications of Biden administration lifting some sanctions from Iran and unfreezing billions in assets on Sunday night in America. That was this past Sunday, so there was something going on. I guess they was talking about it on the news or something. A nuclear agreement with Iran is expected within days, a European diplomat told Fox News on Friday, coming after weeks of renewed talks in Vienna to revive the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. The diplomat cautioned, however, that any deal involving Iran and China could fall apart, and the United States and all of us in Russia could all fall apart in no time. Meanwhile, on Thursday, Iran's chief negotiator told reporters that a deal would be done within 24 or 48 hours. Now, I have not heard much more on this, except that on, and I think I sent this out to my Sunday school class, it was a 5 and 5 news from Skywatch TV. They were talking about one of our old or retired diplomats was given information to try to get it out there to our government, telling them that our diplomats in these talks had done such a poor job and give up so much that they've actually left the meetings, and now China and Russia are there negotiating with Iran on the deal. It is really a messed up situation, which, why is this so important? because we know that Iran says they will destroy Israel first and America second. Why would we ever give Iran nuclear capability if they have already said they're going to destroy Israel and we're second on the hit list? So we'll see. Other things, Iran nearing nuclear threshold, and I'm running out of time because I really wanted to keep this down to a minimum if I could. But last month, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken signed a waiver that restored the ability of foreign companies and other countries to participate in civilian nuclear and safety projects in Iran. And this article just keeps going on and on and on about it. And I know that Brett Baer of Fox News actually said, how are they even over there negotiating if we're Iran and Russia, or not Iran, but Ukraine and Russia is in a war? And you can go back to that center article. It says, ask for the question of Russia diplomats negotiating in Vienna during a European flight embargo on Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. The diplomat told Fox that there can always be exceptions made for diplomats. So it's almost like, hey, look over here at this war going on while we slip in the new Iranian nuclear deal, because most Americans, that is a very unpopular thing. Polls have shown that Americans do not want Iran to become a nuclear power. So that's one thing that's going on in the world. Kremlin says that Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, remember he's the one that took over Netanyahu's place, but Naftali Bennett met in Moscow with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Saturday. Wonder what that's all about. And then I found out yesterday, I think, that the president, now this is the Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. Most people don't realize that Israel has a president, but it's more of a ceremonial type position. All the power is actually with their Prime Minister. And so the president of Israel, and I can't think of his name right now, has actually went in, first time in 14 years, he is in Turkey meeting with the Turkey, I don't know if it's a president, prime minister, or what, but he's there meeting with them. So it just makes me wonder what's going on in Israel, meeting with the Kremlin, with Turkey. My suspicion is that it has something to do with Syria. If you notice, since Netanyahu had left, we know that there are missiles being brought in from Iran into Syria along the Israeli border. And for the first time, I think the first time that they've actually sent missiles over to destroy some of those stockpiles of weaponry, it's just been in the last few weeks. And I think that that's my suspicion, that they may be talking to Turkey and Russia about it, because Russia is in Syria. And Syria, when we left Syria in such shambles, Russia stepped in to kind of keep the country from falling completely apart. Although I can't say that they've done it. They've really kind of turned a blind eye. Putin and Netanyahu had a really good relationship. They respected each other. They were both military men. They came from the same sort of backgrounds. They grew up through the military and became leaders of their country. And if I'm not mistaken, Netanyahu was actually injured by a bullet or something in one of the wars that he fought in. But anyway, long story short, they had a good relationship. So anytime Netanyahu sent missiles over into Syria to take out stockpiled inventory of military missiles or whatever might be there, Putin kind of turned his head and didn't do anything about it. I'm wondering if this might be something about that, since they did an airstrike in the last couple of weeks, if they're not there with Turkey and Moscow trying to make. We'll see. I don't know. That's just a suspicion of mine, but we'll have to wait and see what comes out of that. Next is the World Economic Forum. I don't want y'all to think that Putin's just a good guy defending his country. No, he's part of this World Economic Forum, New World Order, whatever you want to call it. It says that Russia joins Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution Network. Then we know what that is. It's digital currency coming. And so they said it'll be here by 2025, 2030 at the latest. And we see that America, just in the last few weeks or month, has actually set up for a digital currency here, some rules and regulations on what that might entail. So just be careful, because we found out with what was going on with the trucker convoy up in Canada, we saw what can happen to digital currency. what was it, about $11 million had been donated by different folks all over the world, but it's a lot of it came from the United States of America and Canada itself. And what happened? It was a lesson for us, because when things are digital, what happened? The government seized it anytime they wish, and they can do the exact same thing with digital currency. You need to keep cash alive. Use cash as much as you can. Keep using cash. Cash will always be around unless digital currency comes in. If it does, then you have lost total control of your finances, because at any time that you don't do what the government tells you to do, they can cut your currency off if it's digital. Here's another thing that happened that you don't hear much about, but merchant ships hit by missiles. 30% of the world grain exports stalled in the Black Sea. Between Ukraine and Russia, they have 37% of all the wheat exported. That is really going to hurt us in the grocery stores. And this don't even talk about their oil exports and all that. And I meant to go back. I wanted to show y'all something else about Ukraine. And I need to cover that before I close out on this. Ukraine. This is the pipelines coming out of Russia into Europe. Okay? There is only two countries that stands between the European Union freezing to death and all of their energies shut off, and that is Belarus and Ukraine, the two countries that are not part of NATO, that's right up there next on the border of Russia. Okay? Pipelines come in through Belarus and they come through Ukraine. Of course, I'm sure that this war has nothing to do with Hunter Biden's business deal with Burisma. But just so you can see that. Now, this little dotted line that's coming in from way up north, which is Russia too, by the way, is coming down. This is the proposed, that's the Nord Stream pipeline that's supposed to go into Germany. It has actually been completed and finished because President Biden lifted sanctions. It had 100 miles to go, and President Biden lifted sanctions that President Trump had put down on Russia and wouldn't let them build it. But President Biden lifted those sanctions. Now that pipeline has been finished, but Germany won't certify it because of this war that's going on in Ukraine. But don't let anybody fool you guys. It's going to go from Germany over into the United Kingdom and supply them with gas, natural gas, and oil. Don't let anybody kid you. It doesn't matter what happens in Ukraine. Europe cannot afford to let Putin turn their gas off. They get, I can't remember what the percentage is, but it's like 75% of their energy comes from Russia. That pipeline will be certified because Germany is not going to turn down that energy. Because if something happens here and these pipelines are shut down, at least they have another one coming into their own country. So it's just a matter of time before that takes place. All right, that tells you about the gas line situation. All right, so I think that covered just about everything, but just so that we don't leave on a bad note, I want to show you something. There's 4 scripture verses that I went and pulled out of the Bible for you, and it says, in Romans, it says, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but from God, and the powers that be are ordained by God." Biden is in office for a reason. We may not understand it, but we do see that end-time events has to take place. And Russia invading Ukraine makes all the sense in the world when you realize Ukraine is part of the Magog Invasion. They will be a part of that. We see in Daniel 2, it says, "It is he who changes the times and the epochs," he being God. Okay? "He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding." And epochs is just a Jewish term that means, I think an epoch means 500 years, but it may be 1,000. I can't remember if it's 1,000 or not. But you can think of it at end of an age type deal. In Daniel 4, it says, "This sentence is by decree." Now, you got to remember, this was King Nebuchadnezzar. He was the dictator of the whole known world, the Babylonian Empire. And it says, "This sentence is by the decree of the angelic watchers." Those angelic watchers is what you would think of as those chief priests, or not priests, the chief princes that we were talking about that's operating supernaturally out in it's not in our reality, it's outside of our reality. The decree of the angelic watchers, and the decision is a command of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and bestows it on whom he wishes, and sets over it the lowliest of men. And finally, last but not least, this is Jesus Christ talking himself in John 19. It says, Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me." Now, he's sitting before Pontius Pilate, getting ready to receive the edict to be crucified. And Jesus said, "You have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For the reason he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." In other words, he's telling Pontius Pilate, the person who betrayed me has more of an issue of sin than Pontius Pilate, because Pontius Pilate has been set in place by God himself to give that decree. So don't go away thinking all is lost, all this is. We are looking at, I believe, end time events starting to line up, those countries starting to line up together. But I do not believe that this is out of the control of God. God's put these people in place over these countries, these leaders, to cause this to happen, because his plan has to go forward. And what's his plan? His plan is the whole entire book of Revelation. It's the Gog-Magog war. It is the Psalm 83 war. All these things will take place. It's just a matter of time, and it will be done in God's time. I often think back and think, why in the world was Trump, why did he get removed out of office? Why did God allow him to be removed? Because Trump put Jerusalem back on the map as a capital of Israel. We moved our embassy there. It was the first country to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of the world. So why was, what I would say would be, removed from office as punishment or something? But I don't think that was what it was. I think Trump was in office to give us a reprieve, because the timing was not hardly right for these situations to go down the way God plans for them to go down. So just want to leave that with that. And hopefully you'll join me for part 2 of this lesson. We're going to get more into what is going to happen when Russia and all of their allies ends up invading Israel, how God supernaturally takes care of that situation. But also, you got to remember, Ezekiel 38 and 39 is so popular because that's the one place in the Bible that we think talks about nuclear war. And we'll talk about more of that next week. If you like this channel, subscribe. And anyway, we just try to line up current events with biblically, so that we know what's going on. It's not just something that's rumored or whatever. We want to make sure that we are biblically correct in what we teach. With that, I hope y'all have a wonderful rest of the week.